The most heartbreaking story in Adventure Time is not about a man who lost his mind, it is about a man who got it back. Simon Petrikov's transformation into the Ice King is presented throughout the series as tragedy, as loss, as the destruction of a good man by a cursed artifact. We watch through video diaries as he deteriorates, as he forgets Betty, as he becomes the blue-skinned screaming creature who kidnaps princesses and talks to penguins. The narrative invites us to mourn what was lost, to hope for restoration, to believe that if only Simon could return, if only the crown's influence could be lifted, then happiness would follow. But when restoration finally comes in Fionna and Cake, we discover something the narrative did not prepare us for. Simon restored is not Simon saved. He is Simon devastated, Simon purposeless, Simon confronting an existence that the crown had mercifully obscured. This is not the story we were promised. We were promised that getting Simon back would be the happy ending, that beneath the Ice King's madness, the real person waited to emerge, that love would triumph and the curse would be broken and everything would be okay. The show spent years building toward this restoration, treating it as the goal, the prize, the thing that would make the suffering worthwhile. And then it gave us what we asked for, and showed us that what we asked for was not what we thought it was. Simon Restored is a man who has lost everything, who exists in a world where everyone he loved is dead or transformed, who carries the memory of centuries of humiliation and madness, who must somehow build a life from rubble that the Ice King never had to see. The question this raises is uncomfortable but necessary. Was the Ice King actually happier than Simon? Not in some abstract philosophical sense, but in the immediate experiential reality of day-to-day existence. The Ice King woke up each morning with purposes, however delusional. He had projects, relationships, a sense of himself as protagonist in his own story. He did not carry the weight of loss because he did not remember what he had lost. He did not grieve Betty because he did not know Betty existed. He did not feel the centuries of time because for him there was only the present, only the current scheme, only the immediate pursuit of whatever princess had caught his attention. His existence was not dignified, but it was not devastated either. It was simply what it was, experienced without the context that would have made it unbearable. Simon, by contrast, has all the context. He remembers being the Ice King, remembers the centuries of madness, remembers every humiliating moment that his restored consciousness now recognizes as humiliating. He remembers Betty, remembers losing her not once but twice, first to his own deterioration and then to her sacrifice that saved him at the cost of herself. He exists in a world that moved on without him, surrounded by people who knew him only as a joke, who must now recalibrate their understanding of the screaming blue man they mocked and avoided. His restoration is not return to a life, but arrival in a aftermath, not recovery, but confrontation with everything. Recovery cannot undo. The show's willingness to explore this territory represents a maturity that most narratives avoid. The curse-breaking restoration is supposed to be the happy ending, the moment when the credits roll and we assume everything will be fine. By showing us what comes after, by refusing the easy satisfaction of restoration as resolution, Adventure Time asks harder questions about what we actually want when we want someone to get better. Do we want them to be happy, or do we want them to be themselves? Do we want their suffering to end, or do we want their awareness to return? These are not the same thing, and the Ice King's story reveals the gap between them with painful clarity. The philosophical territory here is genuinely difficult. We value authenticity, believe that being truly ourselves is better than being happy illusions. We value consciousness, believe that awareness is preferable to oblivion, even when awareness is painful. But the Ice King challenges these values by presenting a case where inauthenticity was functional and awareness is devastating. He forces us to ask whether our preference for authenticity and consciousness is really about the well-being of the person in question, or about our own comfort, our own sense that things should be a certain way, regardless of whether that way actually serves anyone's interests. The structure of this analysis will explore what seems like a perverse proposition, that the Ice King, despite everything we are told about his condition, despite the tragedy the show constructs around him, despite our intuitive sense that madness must be worse than sanity, was actually living a more bearable existence than Simon now endures. This is not an argument that the Ice King's existence was good. It was not good. It was diminished, delusional, incapable of the depth and meaning that genuine human flourishing requires. But bearability is different from goodness, and survival is different from flourishing. And the question we must ask is not whether the Ice King's life was ideal, but whether it was more livable than what Simon faces now. The implications of this question extend beyond Adventure Time to broader issues of how we think about mental illness, cognitive impairment, and the relationship between happiness and truth. We assume that reality is always better than delusion, that knowing the truth is preferable to comfortable lies, that consciousness should be maximized, regardless of what consciousness reveals. The Ice King's story challenges these assumptions, not by refuting them entirely, but by revealing their limits, by showing cases where truth is unbearable and delusion is protective, where less consciousness might actually be more merciful than more. The show's willingness to sit with this complexity rather than resolving it is part of what makes Adventure Time exceptional as a work of narrative art. Lesser shows would have ended with restoration, would have treated Simon's return as the happy ending, would have faded to black before we had to see what came next. Adventure Time shows us what comes next, refuses the comfort of premature resolution, insists that we watch Simon grapple with an existence that the narrative had promised would be better. This insistence is not cruelty but honesty, the acknowledgement that some problems do not have solutions, that some tragedies do not end, that getting what you want is not always the same as getting what you need. The setup for this thesis requires understanding what the show tells us about both states, the Ice King's centuries of existence and Simon's post-restoration struggle. We must look at what the crown took, but also at what it provided, at the tragedy of loss, but also at the function that loss served. The conventional narrative emphasizes the taking, treats the Ice King years as simply damage to be undone. But damage that lasts centuries cannot be simply undone. It becomes structure, becomes identity, becomes the only existence a consciousness knows. The Ice King was not waiting to be cured. He was living in his own way, and his way of living had features that Simon's restored existence lacks. The cultural context in which we receive this story matters for how we evaluate its claims. We live in an era that valorizes mental health, that treats psychological suffering as problems to be solved, that assumes treatment is always preferable to illness and awareness always preferable to its absence. These assumptions are often correct, often point toward genuine goods that we should pursue. But they are not always correct, not in every case, not when the suffering in question exceeds what any treatment can address, or when awareness reveals truths that no consciousness should have to carry. The Ice King's story tests our assumptions by presenting a case that does not fit neatly into our frameworks. that asks us to consider whether our commitments to consciousness and authenticity serve the beings in question or merely ourselves. The conventional narrative of Simon's tragedy emphasizes what the crown took from him, cataloguing losses that accumulated over centuries until almost nothing remained. The crown took his memories, erasing Betty and his academic career and everything that made him Simon Petrikov rather than a random consciousness in a blue body. The crown took his appearance, transforming him into something monstrous, something that frightened children and repelled potential friends, something that marked him visibly as other. The crown took his sanity, replacing coherent thought with delusion, replacing reasonable goals with absurd obsessions, replacing the capacity for genuine relationship with patterns of behavior that drove everyone away. These losses are real, genuinely terrible, deserving of the mourning the show invites us to feel. The video diaries that document Simon's deterioration are among the most affecting pieces of storytelling in Adventure Time. Small windows into a process of loss that unfolds with terrible inevitability. We watch him struggle to remember why he is making the recordings, watch him address Betty with increasing confusion about who she is, watch him recognize that he is disappearing and be unable to stop it. These diaries establish the tragedy on a personal level, make us care about Simon as an individual, ensure that his loss lands emotionally rather than remaining abstract. They are essential to the show's treatment of the Ice King, transforming him from joke to tragedy, from villain to victim. But the conventional narrative's focus on loss can obscure what was also happening during those centuries of madness. While Simon was losing himself, the Ice King was living, was having experiences, was existing in ways that the tragedy frame tends to minimize. The Ice King's life was not empty. It was full of schemes and adventures, full of interactions with the other characters, full of moments that, from inside his experience, were meaningful, even if from outside they appeared pathetic. To focus only on what was lost is to ignore what was present. To treat centuries of existence as simply a gap between the real Simon and his eventual restoration. To deny the Ice King the reality of his own experience. The psychological research on memory and identity raises complicated questions about what exactly was lost when Simon became the Ice King. Memory is not simply storage, but active construction, not a warehouse of fixed records, but an ongoing process of creating and recreating the self. When Simon's memories were suppressed by the crown, a new self emerged, a self with its own memories, its own patterns, its own identity, constructed from the raw materials that remained. This new self was not Simon, but it was someone, a conscious being with experiences that mattered to it, with preferences and goals and relationships that were real from its own perspective. To say that the Ice King was simply Simon, minus his memories, understates the extent to which he was a different being entirely. This distinction matters for how we evaluate the tragedy and its resolution. If the Ice King was simply damaged Simon, then restoration is clearly good, is the repair of something broken, is the return of the real person. But if the Ice King was his own being, constructed from the wreckage of Simon, but no longer reducible to him, then restoration is more complicated, involves not just repair but replacement, the elimination of one consciousness to make room for another. Simon's return required the Ice King's end, and whether this exchange was worthwhile depends on how much moral weight we grant to the Ice King's existence, to his centuries of experience, to his identity as a being in his own right, rather than simply a corruption of someone else. The show does not resolve this question definitively, presents both frames without privileging either. Some moments treat the Ice King as simply sick Simon, waiting to be cured. Other moments treat him as his own person, with his own value, deserving of consideration beyond his status as Simon's unfortunate replacement. This ambiguity is appropriate to the genuine difficulty of the question, resists the easy answers that would make one frame obviously correct and the other obviously wrong. What we lose and what we gain in transformations of consciousness is genuinely unclear, and the show's refusal to clarify reflects respect for this genuine unclarity. The crown's role in Simon's transformation complicates the moral picture further. The crown is not simply a disease that damaged Simon, but an artifact with its own agency, its own purposes, its own relationship to the being it transforms. It chose Simon in some sense, attached itself to him, began the process of transformation that would eventually erase his original identity. This agency means that Simon's transformation was not simply misfortune, but something closer to predation, the deliberate targeting of a consciousness for consumption by something that needed a host. The Ice King is not just Simon transformed, but Simon consumed, his identity eaten away to make room for something the crown required. This predatory aspect of the crown adds layers to the tragedy, but also to the question of happiness. The Ice King was in some sense the crown's creation, shaped to serve the crown's purposes, made into something that would continue to wear the crown and do whatever it is the crown wants done. His happiness, such as it was, might have been engineered, might have been part of how the crown maintains its hold on its hosts, might have been as artificial as everything else about his existence. If his contentment was manufactured by the thing that destroyed him, does that make it less real, less valuable, less relevant to our assessment of his well-being? The question of manufactured happiness has relevance beyond Adventure Time, connects to debates about pharmaceutical interventions, about the authenticity of chemically induced contentment, about whether happiness matters only if it emerges from genuine engagement with reality. The Ice King's crown-induced functionality might be analogous to medication that manages symptoms without addressing underlying conditions, that makes life bearable without making it meaningful, that produces something like happiness without the substance that happiness usually implies. Whether such manufactured states have value is genuinely contested, and the Ice King's case provides a vivid illustration of why the question is so difficult. The video diaries serve another function beyond establishing tragedy. They show us Simon's values, his priorities, the things that mattered to him when he was still himself. He recorded them for Betty, wanted her to know that he loved her even when he could no longer remember why, wanted to preserve some record of who he was against the erasure he knew was coming. These priorities, so clearly articulated in the diaries, stand in stark contrast to what the Ice King values. The Ice King does not think about Betty, does not try to preserve his true self, does not struggle against his condition, because he does not know there is anything to struggle against. The diaries document not just loss, but the complete replacement of one value system with another. This replacement of values complicates the question of whether restoration is good. When we restore Simon, we restore not just his memories, but his values, his priorities, his sense of what matters and what does not. These values include the capacity to grieve, the drive to remember, the commitment to authenticity that makes his current existence so painful. The Ice King's values did not include these things, did not make room for the suffering that Simon now experiences. In restoring Simon's values, along with his memories, we restore the very things that make his restoration painful. A different set of values might process restoration differently, might find in Simon's situation something other than devastation. But Simon is Simon, values what Simon values, and what he values makes his situation unbearable. The relationship between memory, identity, and values is philosophically complex, and the show does not pretend to resolve it. What it offers is illustration, a vivid case study in how these elements interact when trauma disrupts their normal configuration. Simon's memories were suppressed, his identity was replaced, his values were transformed, and the result was a being who functioned where Simon might have collapsed. Whether this functioning was better or worse than collapse depends on criteria that the show does not specify, leaves for viewers to determine according to their own values and their own sense of what matters in the assessment of a life. The case for the Ice King's happiness rests on what the crown gave, rather than what it took, on the functions that his delusions served, on the protection that forgetting provided. This is not a comfortable argument. It seems to celebrate madness, to prefer illusion over truth, to suggest that consciousness is a burden we might be better off without. But discomfort does not make an argument wrong, and the evidence from the show supports a reading in which the Ice King's existence, while not enviable, was also not the unrelieved suffering that the tragedy frame implies. Consider what the Ice King had that Simon lacks. The Ice King had purpose. Every day brought schemes to pursue, princesses to kidnap, plans to execute. These purposes were delusional, based on false beliefs about himself and his situation. But they were purposes nonetheless, reasons to get out of bed, structures that organized his existence and gave it direction. Purpose is one of the strongest predictors of psychological well-being, and the Ice King had it in abundance, never questioning whether his life meant anything, never struggling with the emptiness that haunts those who have lost their reasons for being. His purposes were not good purposes, but they were purposes, and their presence protected him from the purposelessness that devastates Simon. The Ice King had relationships. Gunter, the penguin, was a genuine companion, a being he cared for and who responded to his care. The other penguins populated his kingdom, gave him subjects to rule, provided the social context that consciousness seems to require. His attempts to connect with the princesses of Oo, while misguided and often harmful, reflected a real drive for connection, a real need for relationship that his existence partially satisfied. He was not isolated, in the way that Simon is isolated, was not alone with his awareness in a world of strangers. He had his penguins, his kingdom, his delusional but functional social world. The Ice King had identity. He knew who he was, what he wanted, what role he played in the world. This identity was false, constructed on the erasure of his true history, but it was stable and functional, provided the consistent sense of self that psychological health requires. He did not struggle with questions of who he really was, did not face the fragmentation that comes when identity is uncertain, did not experience the vertigo of selfhood that Simon must navigate. His identity was a lie, but it was a coherent lie, and coherence has value independent of truth. Most importantly, the Ice King did not remember what he had lost. He did not grieve Betty because he did not know Betty. He did not mourn his academic career because he did not remember having one. He did not carry the weight of centuries because for him there were no centuries, only the eternal present of his current schemes and desires. This forgetting was not chosen, was imposed by the crown against what Simon would have wanted, but its effect was protective, regardless of its origin. The Ice King was spared the suffering that comes from knowing what you have lost, from comparing your current diminished state to what you once were, from carrying grief across timescales that no consciousness should have to endure. The contrast with Simon makes these protections visible. Simon remembers everything the Ice King forgot. He carries Betty with him, carries the loss of her twice over, carries the knowledge that she sacrificed herself for his restoration and is now gone in ways that might be permanent. He remembers being the Ice King, remembers the centuries of humiliation, that his restored consciousness now recognizes as humiliation must somehow integrate those memories into a coherent self that can continue to function. He exists in the aftermath of everything, surrounded by the evidence of loss, confronting each day the reality of what was taken and what remains. His consciousness is a burden in ways that the Ice King's consciousness never was. The psychological concept of defensive mechanisms is relevant here. The mind develops strategies to protect itself from experiences it cannot handle. Strategies that might look like dysfunction from outside but serve protective functions from inside. Denial, repression, dissociation, all of these mechanisms distance consciousness from material that would otherwise overwhelm it. The Ice King's entire existence might be understood as a massive defensive mechanism, a way of being in the world that protected him from the truth of his situation. This protection was not healthy in any clinical sense, was not the kind of coping that therapy would recommend, but it was effective, allowed centuries of existence that would have been impossible if full awareness had been maintained. The Ice King's relationships, however distorted, also provided something that Simon now lacks: connection, however superficial. Gunter was genuinely important to him, a being he cared for and who seemed to care for him in return. His attempts to connect with princesses, while pathological and harmful, reflected a real drive toward relationship that his existence partially satisfied. He was not alone in the way that Simon is alone, was not isolated with his grief in a world where everyone he knew is dead or transformed beyond recognition. His social world was delusional but present, populated with beings he interacted with daily, structured by relationships that gave his existence texture, even if that texture was not what healthy relationship provides. Simon's social situation is far more complicated. The people who knew him as the Ice King must recalibrate their understanding, must learn to see the person behind the madness they had dismissed or mocked. Marceline, who loved him and lost him and built a relationship with the Ice King that was separate from her relationship with Simon, must now navigate the return of someone who is and is not the being she has known for centuries. Finn and Jake, who treated the Ice King as villain and nuisance, must now confront the person whose suffering produced the behaviour they found annoying or threatening. These social complications do not prevent Simon from having relationships, but they make those relationships fraught in ways the Ice King's relationships never were. The argument that the Ice King was happier than Simon does not require that the Ice King was happy in any absolute sense. It requires only that his existence was more bearable than Simon's current existence, that the delusions and forgetting that characterized his state provided protection that Simon now lacks. Bearability is a low bar, lower than flourishing or meaning or genuine happiness, but it is the relevant bar for comparing these two states. The Ice King cleared it. Whether Simon will clear it remains to be seen. The structure of the Ice King's days provided something that Simon's days currently lack: routine, expectation, the sense that each day has a shape and purpose. The Ice King knew what he was going to do when he woke up. He had schemes to execute, penguins to tend, princesses to pursue. This structure was pathological, based on delusions, but it was structure nonetheless, and structure is one of the things that makes existence bearable. Simon wakes up without structure, without clear purpose, without the delusional but functional framework that organized the Ice King's existence. He must somehow construct meaning from the rubble of his restoration, build a life from materials that seem inadequate to the task. The Ice King's emotional range, while limited, was also protective in its limitation. He did not experience the depths of grief that Simon now experiences because he was not capable of them, because the crown had narrowed his emotional capacity along with his memories. This narrowing looks like loss from outside, like damage to a full human being, but from inside it might have felt like relief, like freedom from feelings too big to bear. Simon's restored emotional capacity gives him access to the full range of human feeling, including the feelings of devastation and despair that characterize his post-restoration existence. More capacity is not always better when what capacity provides is access to suffering. The comparison between Ice King and Simon also illuminates the relationship between happiness and meaning. The Ice King had happiness of a sort, the contentment that comes from pursuing goals without questioning them, the satisfaction of a consciousness that does not know enough to be dissatisfied. But he did not have meaning, not in the sense of a life that adds up to something, that connects to values larger than immediate desire, that matters in ways the living of it cannot fully contain. Simon has the capacity for meaning, but finds that capacity empty, because everything that might have given his life meaning has been taken from him. He has the framework for a meaningful life without the content that would fill it. The Ice King had neither framework nor content, but seemed more functional than Simon with his empty framework. The mercy of forgetting is not a concept our culture handles well. We valorize memory, treat it as sacred, believe that remembering is always better than forgetting, regardless of what is being remembered. We build memorials and write histories, and insist that forgetting is betrayal, that those who forget are diminished, that consciousness requires the full weight of the past to be authentic and complete. But this valorization ignores the cost of remembering, the burden that memory imposes, the way that some pasts are too heavy to carry. The Ice King's forgetting was not betrayal but protection, not diminishment but relief, not loss of authenticity but escape from a weight that would have crushed any consciousness forced to bear it. Consider what Simon would have experienced if he had retained full memory throughout the crown's influence. He would have been aware of his own madness, trapped inside a mind he could not control, watching himself do things he would never have chosen, unable to stop or even influence the being he had become. This is a particular kind of hell, the horror of consciousness without agency, of awareness without control. The crown spared him this horror by suppressing not just his memories, but his continuous awareness, by allowing him to become someone else who did not experience the transformation as loss because he did not remember what had been lost. The forgetting was mercy, even if it was not intended as such, even if its primary function was to serve the crown's purposes rather than Simon's well-being. The psychological literature on trauma supports the protective function of forgetting in some circumstances. Dissociative amnesia, whatever its costs, serves to protect consciousness from experiences it cannot integrate, provides distance from events that would otherwise overwhelm. The mind's capacity to forget is not simply a failure of storage, but an active protection, a mechanism that shields us from the full impact of experiences that exceed our capacity to process. Simon's centuries as the Ice King would have been traumatic beyond comprehension if he had been aware throughout, if he had watched himself deteriorate and could not stop it, if he had experienced each humiliation with the full knowledge of who he used to be. The Crown's suppression of his awareness, whatever else it did, protected him from this continuous trauma. The ethics of induced forgetting are genuinely complicated, and the show's treatment of them resists easy resolution. We generally believe that consciousness should not be altered without consent, that individuals have the right to their own minds, that imposed forgetting is a violation even when it reduces suffering. But these principles assume that the suffering in question is bearable, that consciousness can handle whatever it is asked to carry, that awareness is always preferable to oblivion, regardless of what awareness contains. The Ice King's case challenges these assumptions by presenting suffering that genuinely exceeds what consciousness can bear, duration that no mind should have to span, losses that accumulate beyond any capacity to process. In such cases, the ethics become less clear, the preference for awareness less obviously correct. The show suggests that Simon himself might recognize the mercy in his forgetting, might understand that the Ice King's obliviousness was preferable to the alternative. His depression in Fionna and Cake, his struggle to find reasons to continue, his overwhelming grief, all suggest that restored awareness is not the gift the conventional narrative promised. He got what we thought he wanted, what we thought would make everything okay, and it did not make everything okay. It made him conscious of everything that was not okay, gave him the awareness to feel the full weight of his losses, provided the memory that transforms bearable present into unbearable past. Whether he would choose, if given the choice, to return to the Ice King's oblivion is left ambiguous, but the question itself suggests that the choice is not obvious, that awareness might not be worth its cost. The broader implications of this analysis extend beyond Simon's particular case to questions about consciousness and suffering that philosophy has long grappled with. Is awareness always good? Is forgetting always loss? Is the examined life necessarily better than the unexamined one, even when examination reveals only devastation? These questions have no easy answers, and the show's treatment of Simon and the Ice King provides no easy answers either. What it provides is the complexity itself, the refusal to pretend that restoration is simply good or forgetting simply bad, the insistence that we sit with the difficulty rather than resolving it prematurely. The experience of survivors, of those who have endured traumas that exceed normal processing capacity, speaks to the protective function of forgetting in ways that support this analysis. Many survivors report that the period immediately following trauma, before full memory consolidates, was in some ways easier than the period after, when the reality of what happened became fully available to consciousness. The mind's initial protective numbing, its refusal to fully register what occurred, serves a function, creates space for survival that full awareness might not permit. Simon's centuries of forgetting might be understood as extended numbness, a state that protected him from the full impact of his losses until restoration made that protection impossible. The ethics of wishing forgetting on someone are genuinely troubling, and this analysis should not be read as advocacy for induced amnesia or chemical forgetting. The Ice King's forgetting was not chosen, was not a treatment he consented to, was the result of a parasitic artifact pursuing its own purposes. To say that his forgetting had protective effects is not to say that forgetting should be imposed on others, that consciousness should be reduced when it causes suffering, that the solution to psychological pain is the elimination of the psychology that feels it. These would be dangerous conclusions, and the show does not endorse them. What the show does endorse, or at least suggest, is that our assumptions about consciousness and its value deserve examination. We treat awareness as an unqualified good, treat the examined life as obviously superior, treat memory as sacred, and forgetting as always loss. The Ice King's story complicates these assumptions without entirely refuting them, shows cases where they fail without claiming they always fail, creates space for nuance in our thinking about what consciousness costs and what it provides. The goal is not to valorize forgetting, but to recognize its complexity, not to prefer madness to sanity, but to acknowledge that the comparison is not as simple as we might assume. The show's treatment of this material reflects a maturity about mental health and cognitive difference that respects the difficulty of these topics. It does not romanticize the Ice King's madness, does not suggest that his existence was secretly better than normal existence, does not argue that we should all embrace delusion as a path to happiness. It simply asks us to notice what we might otherwise miss, that restoration has costs, that consciousness has burdens, that getting what you want is not the same as being happy. These observations are melancholy, but they are also honest, and honesty about difficult topics is part of what makes Adventure Time more than just entertainment. For viewers who have experienced loss, who have wished they could forget, who have wondered whether awareness is worth its cost, Simon's story might resonate with uncomfortable familiarity. The wish to not know, to not remember, to be spared the full weight of what has happened is a common response to grief and trauma. The Ice King represents this wish made real, a being who actually achieved the forgetting that grief sometimes desperately wants. That his forgetting came with its own terrible costs, that it was not actually the solution it might appear to be, does not negate the validity of the wish or the real suffering it reflects. Sometimes the examined life is too much to bear. Sometimes we understand, in our bones, why forgetting might feel like mercy. Betty Groff is the weight that Simon carries, the loss that makes his restoration unbearable, the reason why getting his mind back has not given him his life back. She was his fiancée before the apocalypse, the person he loved more than anything, the one he was trying to protect when he first put on the crown. She time-travelled to save him, sacrificed everything to be with him, and then sacrificed herself entirely, merging with Golb to save him one final time. She is gone now in ways that might be permanent, absorbed into a chaos god, unreachable by any means Simon has found. And Simon remembers all of it. Every moment of their relationship, every stage of losing her, every failed attempt to get her back, the Ice King remembered none of it. The Ice King did not carry Betty because the Ice King did not know Betty existed. The structure of Simon's grief is uniquely cruel because he lost Betty not once but repeatedly, each loss building on the previous ones until the accumulated weight became almost impossible to bear. He lost her first when the crown began to take his mind, when he could feel himself forgetting her, when he recorded video diaries specifically so that some record of his love would survive even when his memory of it did not. He lost her again when she appeared in the present, having time-travelled to save him, only to discover that saving him would require her own transformation into something dangerous and unstable. He lost her finally when she merged with Golb, sacrificing her individual existence to save him and the world, leaving him restored but alone, conscious but grieving, alive, but wondering whether life without her is worth living. The Ice King's relationship with princesses, his obsessive pursuit of them, his desperate attempts to make them love him, might be understood as a distorted echo of his love for Betty, a pattern that survived even when its origin was forgotten. He did not know why he wanted a princess, did not remember Betty or the relationship that shaped his desires, but something in him still reached for connection, still sought the particular kind of love that Betty had represented. This reaching was pathological, harmful to the princesses he pursued, but it also suggests that some core of Simon's capacity for love survived even the crown's most thorough erasures. The desire for Betty became desire for any princess, specific love became generic obsession, but the underlying drive remained. Simon's restored consciousness must now reckon with centuries of this distorted reaching, must recognize in the Ice King's princess obsession a corrupted version of his own love, must confront the ways his deepest feelings were twisted into something harmful and absurd. This reckoning adds another layer to his grief, another dimension of loss to process. It is not just that Betty is gone. It is that his love for her became something monstrous during his absence, that the most sacred thing he possessed was turned into a joke, that the Ice King's princess kidnapping was, in some terrible sense, an expression of Simon's love for Betty filtered through madness until it was unrecognizable. The impossibility of retrieving Betty makes Simon's grief qualitatively different from ordinary grief. When someone dies, grief has a shape, follows a process, eventually reaches something like acceptance, because the finality of death allows no alternative. But Betty is not dead in any simple sense. She is merged with Golb, might still exist in some form, might theoretically be retrievable if only the right approach could be found. This possibility, however remote, prevents the closure that finality provides, keeps Simon reaching for solutions that do not exist, maintains hope that is itself a source of suffering. He cannot accept her loss, because loss implies permanence, and her state does not have the permanence that would allow acceptance. The Ice King never had to make this impossible peace with impossible loss, because the Ice King did not know there was anything to make peace with. His consciousness was not burdened by Betty's absence, because his consciousness did not register Betty's existence. Whatever suffering he experienced, and he did experience suffering, it was not this suffering, was not the specific grief of losing the person you loved most in circumstances that do not allow for closure. His mind was damaged in ways that protected it from this particular damage, broken in ways that happened to spare it from this particular breaking. The mercy of his madness included mercy from Betty, from the knowledge of her, from the weight of losing her. The love story between Simon and Betty is one of the most tragic in Adventure Time, not because it ends badly, but because it keeps ending repeatedly in ways that compound the tragedy with each repetition. Their original separation when the crown began to take Simon was tragic. Betty's time travel to save him, her transformation into Magic Betty, her increasing instability, all tragic. Her final sacrifice, merging with Golb, might be the most tragic of all, because it came after everything else, after all the effort and sacrifice and desperate hoping, and it still did not produce the reunion that both of them wanted. They never got to be together again, not really, not in any sustained way that allowed their love to be lived rather than merely remembered or pursued. Simon's grief for Betty is complicated by guilt, by the sense that everything she suffered was ultimately because of him, because of her love for him, because she could not let him go, even when letting go might have been the healthier choice. She time-travelled because he was in danger. She transformed because she was trying to save him. She merged with Golb because saving him required it. Each step of her tragedy followed from her attachment to him, from her refusal to accept his loss, from a love so profound that it overrode every other consideration, including her own well-being. Simon must carry not only the loss of her, but the knowledge that her loss was, in some sense, his fault, that loving him was what destroyed her. The Ice King carried none of this guilt, because the Ice King did not know there was anything to feel guilty about. His princess obsession, whatever its origins in Simon's love for Betty, was not accompanied by guilt or grief or any sense of responsibility for harm caused. He pursued princesses with cheerful entitlement, believing himself deserving of their love, never questioning whether his pursuit caused damage or whether he bore responsibility for consequences. This absence of guilt was not a moral achievement, but a consequence of his amnesia, the inability to feel guilty about what you cannot remember. Simon's restored guilt is the price of restored memory, the cost of knowing what the Ice King was mercifully spared from knowing. The question of whether Betty would want Simon to suffer as he does, whether her sacrifice was intended to give him a life worth living or merely a life, haunts his post-restoration existence. She gave everything to save him, and what she saved him for is suffering. Is this what she wanted? Is this the outcome her sacrifice was meant to produce? Simon cannot ask her, cannot know whether she would be satisfied with what her sacrifice purchased, cannot receive the guidance from her that might help him understand what he should do with the life she gave him. Her absence is not merely emotional, but practical, leaves him without the person whose input matters most for decisions about how to proceed. The weight of Betty's sacrifice adds obligation to Simon's grief, creates pressure to make his restored life worth what she paid for it. He cannot simply exist, simply survive, simply endure. He must somehow justify her sacrifice by living in a way that honours it. But how do you honour a sacrifice? By living well, when the person who sacrificed is the one you needed to live well. Betty was not just someone Simon loved. She was his reason for living, his purpose, his direction. Without her, the life she saved lacks the very thing that would have made it valuable. He has what she died to give him, and what she died to give him is empty without her. The question of identity that runs through Simon's story asks what makes a person the same person across time and transformation. Simon before the crown, Ice King during the crown's influence, Simon after restoration. Are these three stages of one continuous being, or three distinct beings who share a body and some memories? The answer matters because it determines how we evaluate restoration, whether we see it as the return of the real person or as the replacement of one person with another, whether Simon's current suffering is the continuation of a tragedy or the beginning of a new one. The philosophical literature on personal identity offers multiple frameworks for thinking about this question, none of which provide definitive answers. The memory theory holds that identity consists in psychological continuity, that you are the same person as a past being if you have memories that connect you to that being. By this theory, Simon restored is continuous with Simon before the crown, because he has recovered the memories that link them, while the Ice King was a different person because those memories were suppressed. But this theory has problems, fails to account for the Ice King's centuries of experience, treats hundreds of years of consciousness as simply a gap in the real person's existence, rather than as a life in its own right. The narrative theory holds that identity consists in the story a person tells about themselves, the coherent account that links past, present, and future into a unified whole. By this theory, Simon restored is struggling to construct an identity because his narrative has been shattered, because no coherent story can integrate antiquarian scholar, mad ice wizard, and grieving restored man into a single arc that makes sense. The Ice King had a narrative, however delusional, that organized his existence and gave him a sense of who he was. Simon has fragments that do not cohere, memories that do not integrate, a life story that reads like three different stories awkwardly stitched together. The show does not commit to any particular theory of identity, but dramatizes the problem through Simon's struggle to know who he is now that he is himself again. He is not the Ice King, but the Ice King's memories are his memories. He is not the antiquarian scholar he was before the crown, but that scholars' values and attachments have returned. He is something new, shaped by both previous stages but identical to neither. A being who must construct an identity from materials that do not quite fit together. This construction is part of what makes his restoration so difficult, adds to his suffering the additional burden of not knowing who he is, even as he feels everything a person could feel. The Ice King did not have this problem. His identity was false but stable, built on delusions but functional, consistent across centuries in ways that Simon's post-restoration identity is not. He knew who he was. The Ice King, ruler of the Ice Kingdom, pursuer of princesses, companion of Gunther. These self-conceptions were not accurate, did not reflect his true history or his real situation, but they provided the stable foundation that identity requires. Simon has accuracy without stability, truth without coherence, memories that are really his, but that do not add up to a clear sense of who he is now. The relationship between identity and happiness is not straightforward, but some relationship clearly exists. Beings who know who they are tend to function better than beings who do not, tend to navigate the world more effectively, tend to experience less of the anxiety and confusion that identity uncertainty produces. The Ice King's false but stable identity served him better, by this metric, than Simon's true but unstable identity serves him now. Knowing who you are, even if who you think you are is wrong, might be more functional than not knowing who you are, even if your uncertainty is based on accurate information. The Ice King was confidently wrong. Simon is accurately confused. Which state is more livable is genuinely unclear. The possibility that Simon might eventually construct a new identity, might integrate his various stages into a coherent narrative, might find stability without sacrificing accuracy, remains open. But this construction will take time if it happens at all, will require resources that Simon may not have, will demand energy that his grief and depression may not leave available. The Ice King achieved identity immediately, automatically, as a consequence of the crown's transformation. Simon must achieve identity through effort, must build what was given to the Ice King, must work for what his damaged self received as gift. The question of which self is the real Simon is itself a question the show raises, without answering definitively. Is the real Simon the antiquarian scholar who existed before the crown, the original person whose identity should be restored? Is the real Simon the Ice King the being who actually lived for centuries, whose experiences constitute the majority of the time this body has been conscious? Is the real Simon the restored man who has access to both previous stages but is identical to neither, who must somehow synthesize them into something new? All of these answers have some plausibility, and the show's refusal to privilege one over the others reflects the genuine difficulty of the question. For Simon himself, the question of his real identity is not merely philosophical, but existential, a matter of how to live rather than merely how to think. He must wake up each day as someone, must act in the world as a being with some sense of who he is and what he values and what he wants. The instability of his identity makes this daily existence harder, adds to every decision the preliminary question of who is making the decision, transforms routine choices into opportunities for existential crisis. The Ice King never faced this burden. He knew who he was, however mistakenly, and this knowledge freed him to act without constantly questioning the basis of his actions. The social dimension of identity is also relevant here. We are not merely who we think we are, but who others think we are. Our identities constructed partly through relationships and recognition. Simon's social identity is deeply confused. To Marceline, he is a father figure who was lost and returned, but also the Ice King, who was something different, a being she had to relate to as not Simon for centuries. To Finn and Jake, he is the annoying villain they dealt with for years, now revealed to be a tragic figure deserving compassion rather than annoyance. To himself, he is all of these and none of them, seen by others in ways that do not cohere, receiving reflections that do not add up to a single image. The work of identity construction that Simon faces is work the Ice King never had to do. The crown constructed an identity for him, provided a ready-made sense of self that he could inhabit without effort. Simon must construct his own identity from scratch, using materials that do not quite fit, building something that has never existed before and that has no template to follow. This work is part of what therapy attempts to support, part of what healing from trauma requires. But it is work nonetheless, demanding energy and attention and resources that Simon may not have available given everything else he is dealing with. The timeline of identity formation matters here. The Ice King had centuries to settle into his identity, to establish patterns, to become comfortable in who he was. Simon has had only a short time with his restored identity, is still in the early stages of figuring out who he is now, is expected to function while still in the midst of the most disorienting period of self-reconstruction. Given more time, he might achieve the stability that the Ice King enjoyed. But time passes slowly when you are suffering, and the stability he needs to stop suffering is the very thing he lacks, because he is still suffering. The Ice King's advantage was not just his false identity, but his settled false identity, the centuries of habituation that made his delusions feel like home. Fionna and Cake reveals the depth of Simon's post-restoration, suffering with an honesty that the original series could not have provided. We see him isolated, depressed, unable to connect with the world that has moved on without him. We see him searching desperately for Betty, pursuing any lead that might bring her back, unable to accept that she might be gone forever. We see him contemplating whether continued existence is worthwhile, asking questions that the Ice King never had to ask, because the Ice King never had access to the kind of reflection that produces such questions. The spin-off does not flinch from showing what restoration actually looks like, refuses to pretend that getting Simon back was the happy ending the main series seemed to promise. The depression that characterizes Simon's post-restoration existence is not simply sadness, but a clinical condition, a state that affects his capacity to function, that colors every aspect of his experience, that makes even simple tasks feel insurmountable. This depression is not surprising, given what he has been through, is in fact the expected response to losses of the magnitude he has suffered. But expectations do not reduce suffering. Understanding why you feel terrible does not make you feel less terrible. Simon can trace the causes of his depression with perfect accuracy, can explain exactly why he feels the way he feels. And this explanation provides no relief, no lifting of the weight that makes each day a struggle to survive. The show's willingness to depict depression accurately, without romanticizing or resolving it, represents a maturity in children's entertainment that deserves recognition. Depression is not treated as a problem with a quick solution, not resolved through friendship or adventure, or the power of positive thinking. It is shown as the chronic, persistent, difficult to treat condition it actually is, requiring sustained effort and support, sometimes getting better and sometimes getting worse, never simply disappearing because the story needs it to disappear. Simon's depression is part of who he is now, woven into his restored identity, a consequence of restoration that may never fully resolve. The contrast with the Ice King's mental state illuminates what depression actually costs. The Ice King was not depressed in any clinical sense. He was delusional, obsessive, socially dysfunctional, but he was not depressed. He had energy, had motivation, had the capacity to pursue goals, even if those goals were absurd. His mental illness took a different form, one that preserved the capacity for action, even as it destroyed the capacity for accurate perception. Simon's mental illness is almost the opposite. Accurate perception combined with impaired capacity for action, seeing clearly while being unable to move, understanding everything while being unable to do anything with that understanding. The question of whether Simon's depression might lift with time and treatment is left open by the show, which depicts his struggle without promising resolution. Some depressive episodes resolve through treatment or time or changes in circumstance. Others become chronic, persist despite everything, become permanent features of a person's psychological landscape. Which trajectory Simon's depression will follow is not determined by the narrative, left for viewers to wonder about, for the character to live out in whatever future the show does not depict. The uncertainty is appropriate to the reality of depression, which does not follow predictable arcs and does not guarantee outcomes. Simon's depression also serves narrative functions, justifying his desperate search for Betty, explaining his willingness to take risks that a healthier person might avoid, motivating his engagement with the Fionna and Cake universe that structures the spin-off's plot. His suffering is not merely depicted but used, made to do work in the story, given purpose even as its purposelessness is acknowledged. This narrative integration does not aestheticize his depression, does not suggest that suffering is valuable because it produces plot, but it does recognize that even suffering can be part of a story worth telling, that characters in pain can still be agents in their own narratives. The specific symptoms of Simon's depression are depicted with clinical accuracy. His loss of interest in activities that once brought pleasure, his difficulty concentrating and making decisions, his sleep disturbances and fatigue, his feelings of worthlessness and guilt, all map onto diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder. The show does not name his condition, does not provide the clinical vocabulary that might make it legible to viewers unfamiliar with depression, but the accuracy of its depiction allows those who know depression to recognize what they are seeing. This is not sadness. This is not grief. This is depression, a specific condition with specific characteristics that the show takes seriously. The Ice King's mental state, by contrast, looked more like a thought disorder than a mood disorder, more like the positive symptoms of psychosis than the negative symptoms of depression. His delusions, his disorganized thinking, his inappropriate affect, all suggest a condition quite different from what Simon now experiences. The Crown produced one kind of mental illness. Restoration has produced another. Neither is desirable, but they are different, have different phenomenology, affect functioning in different ways. The Ice King's psychosis allowed for action, even if action was misdirected. Simon's depression impairs action itself, makes even appropriate responses difficult to execute. The question of treatment for Simon's depression is raised but not fully explored by the show. In U, with its magical healing and princess scientists, treatment options might exist that do not exist in our world. But Fionna and Cake suggests that Simon has not found effective treatment, that whatever resources are available have not been sufficient to lift his depression, that he continues to struggle despite whatever interventions he may have tried. This persistence of suffering, despite available treatment, is realistic, reflects how depression often resists intervention, how some cases do not respond to the treatments that work for others. The relationship between Simon's depression and his grief for Betty is complex and bidirectional. His grief contributes to his depression, providing the overwhelming loss that precipitated his current state. But his depression also shapes his grief, making it harder to process, preventing the movement toward acceptance that grief work typically involves, trapping him in an acute phase that might otherwise resolve over time. Depression and grief reinforce each other, create a cycle that is difficult to break, each making the other worse in ways that compound over time. The Ice King had neither grief nor depression of this kind, was spared both the cause and the effect, existed in a mental state that, however impaired, did not include this particular spiral. The social support that might help Simon recover is complicated by the very transformation that created his need for support. The people who might help him are people who knew the Ice King, who built relationships with a being who was not Simon, who must now recalibrate their connections to accommodate his restoration. This recalibration takes time and energy from both sides, creates awkwardness and uncertainty where support needs clarity and confidence. Simon needs help from people who do not quite know how to help him, whose relationship with him is itself in transition, who are dealing with their own adjustments to his return, even as he needs them to focus on his suffering. The loneliness that accompanies Simon's depression is different from the loneliness the Ice King sometimes felt. The Ice King's loneliness was about wanting connection and failing to achieve it, about pursuing princesses who rejected him, about being isolated by his behavior. Simon's loneliness is more fundamental, about existing in a world where he has no place, where everyone he knew is dead or transformed, where the relationships available to him are with people who knew a version of him he does not remember being. He could be surrounded by people and still feel entirely alone, because the connection he lacks is not social but existential, not about having relationships, but about having a world that makes sense. The nature of the crown and its influence on Simon raises questions about agency and responsibility that complicate any simple assessment of his situation. The crown is not a neutral artifact that Simon chose to use, but a parasitic entity that chose him, attached itself to him, began transforming him in ways he neither requested nor could resist. His transformation into the Ice King was not a choice, but an affliction. Not something he did, but something that was done to him. This framing positions him as victim rather than agent, as someone to whom tragedy happened rather than someone who caused tragedy to happen. But the crown's influence does not entirely absolve Simon of responsibility for the Ice King's actions. He put on the crown initially, even if he did not know what it would do. He continued to wear it even as he felt himself changing, because the alternative was to leave Marceline unprotected in a dangerous world. His choices, however constrained, were still choices. decisions made by a being who could have decided otherwise, even if the alternatives were terrible. The Ice King's centuries of harmful behavior emerged from those initial choices, from the decision to wear the crown, even knowing it was changing him, from the priorities that made Marceline's safety more important than his own sanity. The show does not resolve this tension between Simon as victim and Simon as agent, but allows both frames to coexist. He was victimized by the crown, subjected to transformation he did not consent to, made into something he would never have chosen to become. He also made choices that led to this victimization, accepted costs that fell not only on himself but on others, prioritized some values over others in ways that had consequences he could not fully foresee. Both things are true. The crown took his agency, and he exercised agency in allowing the crown to take it. He is victim and agent simultaneously, responsible and not responsible, blameworthy and pitiable at once. This complexity matters for how we evaluate Simon's current suffering and whether it represents justice, tragedy, or something else entirely. If Simon is purely a victim, his suffering is purely tragic, undeserved misfortune that befell someone who did nothing to cause it. If Simon bears some responsibility for his transformation, his suffering might include elements of consequence, outcomes that follow from choices, even if the choices were made under duress. The show suggests that both elements are present, that Simon's suffering is both tragic and consequential, both undeserved and connected to decisions he made. That moral assessment of his situation requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. The Ice King's existence during the centuries of transformation was, by this logic, also both victimization and consequence. He was a victim of the crown's parasitic influence, made into something monstrous without consent or control. He was also a consequence of Simon's choices, the result of decisions that Simon made knowing they would have costs. The Ice King himself bore no responsibility for his condition, since he did not exist until the crown created him. But his existence was nonetheless connected to Simon's agency, emerged from choices that Simon made even if Simon could not foresee their full implications. The question of whether Simon should feel guilty about the Ice King's actions is explored in Fionna and Cake without definitive resolution. He clearly feels something like guilt, clearly struggles with the knowledge that his body committed acts he would never have chosen, clearly bears a sense of responsibility for harm he did not intend and could not prevent. Whether this guilt is justified, whether responsibility can attach to actions taken by a consciousness that was not yours, whether you owe anything to the victims of a being who inhabited your body without your consent, these questions have no clear answers, and the show's willingness to leave them open reflects respect for their genuine difficulty. The crown's parasitic nature complicates traditional frameworks of moral responsibility. We usually hold people responsible for actions they take voluntarily, with knowledge of what they are doing, with the capacity to have done otherwise. Simon's transformation into the Ice King violated all of these conditions. He did not voluntarily become the Ice King. He did not know what he was doing while under the crown's influence. He could not have done otherwise once the transformation was underway. By conventional standards, he is not responsible for the Ice King's actions, should not feel guilty about them, should be able to separate himself from behaviors that were not really his. But guilt does not follow logic, and Simon feels guilty regardless of whether conventional frameworks would assign him responsibility. This guilt might be irrational, might be something he should try to overcome rather than indulge, might be a symptom of his depression rather than an accurate moral assessment, or it might reflect something true, some sense in which responsibility attaches to a body rather than merely a mind. Some obligation that persists even when consciousness is replaced. The show does not adjudicate between these possibilities, presents Simon's guilt without endorsing or condemning it, allows viewers to form their own judgments about whether he should carry this weight. The relationship between Simon and Marceline is particularly complicated by questions of responsibility. Simon took care of Marceline as a child, protected her in the aftermath of the Mushroom War, was her father figure before the Crown took him completely. The Ice King who emerged after Simon's disappearance was not Simon, did not remember caring for Marceline, did not maintain the parental relationship they had built. Marceline had to watch her father figure become something else, had to lose him while he was still physically present, had to build a new relationship with the Ice King that was separate from her relationship with Simon. Simon's restoration brings back the person who loved her, but it also brings back the person who, in some sense, abandoned her, who allowed the Crown to take him, who was not there for the centuries of her life that followed. The victims of the Ice King's behaviour, primarily the princesses he kidnapped and terrorised, represent another dimension of the responsibility question. These victims were harmed by a body that is now Simon's body, by a being who shared his physical form, if not his consciousness. Do they have claims against Simon? Should Simon feel obligated to make amends for harms he did not intend and could not control? The show suggests that something like making amends matters, that Simon cannot simply disclaim responsibility for what his body did, but it does not provide clear guidance about what adequate amends would look like, or whether they are even possible. The Ice King himself, as a being who existed for centuries, might be considered another victim of the Crown's parasitic influence, a consciousness brought into existence only to be eventually erased when restoration occurred. This framing positions the Ice King not as Simon's guilty past, but as another being harmed by the Crown, someone who had a life and lost it, whose erasure was the price of Simon's return. Simon's current suffering might be understood as including grief for the Ice King himself, mourning for the being whose death his restoration required, recognition that his return came at a cost that someone else paid. The ethical complexity of Simon's situation resists the simple narratives we usually tell about good and evil, victim and perpetrator, responsibility and innocence. He is all of these things at once, occupies multiple moral positions simultaneously, cannot be easily categorized in ways that would make our response to him straightforward. This complexity is part of what makes his character so compelling, part of why his story continues to generate discussion and analysis, part of the reason Adventure Time transcends typical children's entertainment to become something that rewards adult engagement. Simon forces us to think harder than we might want to hold contradictions that we would prefer to resolve, to acknowledge that some situations do not admit of easy answers. Adventure Time trains the viewer to see the Ice King as a thing to be dealt with, long before it asks us to see him as a being. For years he functions like a recurring weather pattern. He arrives, he causes trouble, he leaves, and the story resets. He is silly, invasive, occasionally dangerous, mostly irritating. The genre language around him is clear. He is a villain, or at least a nuisance, and villains are problems that stories solve. When the show begins to reveal Simon's past, it does not erase that training, it complicates it. The Ice King becomes tragic, yes, but tragedy often still frames a character as an obstacle with a sad backstory. He is still treated as an affliction that must be lifted so the real person can come back. That framing feels natural, even humane. Who would not want Simon saved? Who would not want Marceline to get her father figure back? Who would not want the man in the tapes to be rescued from the shrieking ice wizard? The problem is that the show spends too many seasons letting the Ice King exist for us to keep pretending he is just an empty shell. He is not empty. He is not merely Simon with errors. He is a personality, stable enough to develop patterns, habits, attachments, tastes, and routines that persist across time. He is not coherent in the way a mentally healthy person is coherent, but he is coherent in the way a person is coherent, meaning there is continuity, there is recognizable temperament. There is a consistent set of emotional reflexes. He is petty and needy, but also capable of tenderness. He is narcissistic, but also desperate to be liked in a way that exposes vulnerability rather than pure cruelty. He can be manipulative, but he can also be sincerely lonely, sincerely excited, sincerely proud. He writes songs. He performs. He makes little domestic gestures in his kingdom. He gets embarrassed. He tries to impress people, then gets angry when they do not validate him. These are not the motions of a blank, malfunctioning machine. They are the motions of a self, a compromised self, but a self nonetheless. Once you acknowledge that, the word restoration changes shape. Restoration stops being only a rescue mission and becomes something closer to an exchange. Simon's return requires the Ice King's end. The show does not dramatize that end like a death scene, which makes it easier to ignore, but morally and philosophically it functions like death. A consciousness that experienced the world for centuries ceases. The body is occupied by another consciousness. The narrative language says, the real one is back, but the experiential reality is, one being is gone. This is not an argument that the Ice King should have stayed. It is an argument that we cannot treat him as if he never counted. The show itself resists that erasure in subtle ways. It gives the Ice King episodes where he is not merely antagonistic, but pitiable in the specific way a person is pitiable, not a monster, not a plot device, but someone whose needs are genuine even when his strategies are destructive. It gives him relationships that matter to him. Gunter is not a prop to the Ice King. Gunter is a companion, the closest thing he has to stability. The penguins are not just set dressing, they are his social world. Even when he is despised, he is still interacting, still forming a sense of place. Marceline's relationship with him is the most ethically charged evidence that he is not merely a problem. Marceline knows better than anyone that he is linked to Simon, but she also knows that the Ice King is not simply Simon waiting behind a curtain. She interacts with the Ice King as the Ice King. She argues with him, she sets boundaries. She also sometimes shows him affection. That is not just pity for Simon, but recognition of the strange person in front of her. That matters because Marceline is not naive. If the Ice King were truly just an empty, corrupted Simon, she would treat him like a medical emergency. Instead, she treats him like a difficult relative who is still, somehow, a relative. Finn and Jake shift too. In early seasons, they respond to him with pure hero logic, defeat the villain, rescue the princess. Over time, that logic gets muddied. They still fight him when they need to, but they also sometimes tolerate him, sometimes include him, sometimes treat him like a neighbour who causes problems, but is also part of the neighbourhood. That is not moral approval. It is social recognition. He belongs to the world they inhabit. If the Ice King is a person, then the tragedy is not only Simon's loss. It is also the tragedy of a mind that lived for centuries inside delusion, built a structure that made life bearable, and then was wiped away. That sounds perverse because it feels like mourning the disease, but it is not mourning the disease, it is mourning the lived reality that emerged under the disease. When we cure someone of a condition that has shaped decades of their life, we do not only remove symptoms, we alter identity. Most of the time, that alteration is welcome. Sometimes it is destabilizing. In Simon's case, it is devastating, and part of that devastation comes from the sheer scale of what restoration demands. It demands that one self disappear and another take responsibility for everything. That is where the Ice King, happier than Simon thesis becomes sharper. If the Ice King is a person, then his happiness is not an irrelevant byproduct of a curse. It is the happiness available to that person in those conditions. It is not noble happiness, it is not deep happiness, but it is functional. It is the kind of happiness that makes tomorrow possible. Simon's restored state has dignity, truth, and moral clarity, but it does not have functionality yet. It does not have ease. It does not have a stable who can move through the day without collapsing under the meaning of it. So the story becomes not "we saved Simon," but "we traded a survivable self for an authentic one." That trade may still be the right one, but the show's brilliance is that it refuses to let the trade feel clean. It makes us sit with the uneasy recognition that what we wanted was not simply a cure, it was the erasure of a person we had grown used to seeing as a joke. When people argue that the Ice King was happier than Simon, the pushback is immediate. He was lonely, he was rejected, he was constantly humiliated. All true. The Ice King's social life is a parade of failure. Princesses fear him and mock him. Finn and Jake fight him. He is the guy nobody invites. His attempts at romance are coercive and embarrassing. He is, in many scenes, a walking portrait of neediness that no one wants to satisfy. And yet, even inside that failure, he has something Simon lacks after restoration, a stable role inside a community. Not a respected role, not a healthy one, but a role that anchors him in the social fabric of ooh. He is expected, he is familiar, he is a known quantity. The Candy Kingdom has procedures for him. The princesses have protocols. Finn and Jake have routines. The social world has a place labelled Ice King, and whenever he shows up, everyone knows how to respond, even if the response is annoyance. That matters more than we tend to admit, because humans and human-like beings do not just need relationships, they need legibility. They need to be recognizable within the shared story of their world. Being hated but known is psychologically different from being pitied but unplaced. The Ice King is woven into Ooh's narrative like a recurring villain in a folk tale. He is part of the landscape. People reference him. They tell stories about him. He has a reputation, and reputation, even negative reputation, is a form of social existence. The Ice King also has a micro-community. His penguins are not sophisticated social partners, but they are constant. They create daily interaction. They respond to him. They populate his world with little needs and routines that make his castle feel inhabited. Gunter, especially, functions like a fixed point. The Ice King talks to Gunter, confides in Gunter, scolds Gunter, relies on Gunter. It is not a relationship of equals, but it is still a relationship in the sense that it provides continuity, companionship, and the illusion, sometimes even the reality, of being cared for. Now consider Simon restored. Simon returns to a world that knows his body but not his self. People have years of experience with Ice King as a social object, and almost no lived experience with Simon as a present tense person. The people who did know Simon in the era that made him Simon are gone. The entire cultural context that gave his identity meaning has vanished. He is not returning to a place he left. He is arriving in a place that grew around the absence he became. This creates a unique social alienation. It is not just loneliness, as in, I have no friends. Simon has people who care about him. Marceline cares. Others have sympathy. But sympathy does not automatically translate into a role. Simon does not have a slot in the world's social grammar. Every interaction becomes negotiation. Every conversation carries the weight of explanation. People do not know whether to treat him like a fragile survivor, a tragic hero, a former villain, or a stranger wearing a familiar face. Often, they try to treat him kindly, but kindness without clarity can feel like hovering, like watching, like handling him with gloves, and that can deepen isolation rather than relieve it. The Ice King, by contrast, never had to explain himself. He did not have to persuade anyone that he existed. He showed up as the Ice King, and the world responded as it always did. There is a brutal comfort in that predictability. Even rejection becomes routine. Even mockery becomes familiar. At least it is interaction. At least it confirms that you are part of the world's loop. Role also supplies structure. A role tells you what your day is for. The Ice King's role, kidnap princesses, cause trouble, be weird, is a horrible role, but it is a job description. It gives the day a shape. It creates expectation. It generates activity. Simon's restored state comes with no job description. He is not needed by the world in any obvious way. He is not the scholar of a civilization that still exists. He is not the protector of a child in a wasteland. He is not the ruler of an ice kingdom. He is a man with a past, in a present that does not require him. This is where restoration can feel like social exile. You are finally yourself, but yourself is not integrated into anything. You are authentic, but authenticity does not automatically create belonging. You can be more real and yet less present in the shared reality of your community. Fionna and Cake leans into this by portraying Simon's days as unmoored. He is surrounded by the aftermath of his own legend. People know about the Ice King. People have stories. But those stories do not give Simon a home. They give him a shadow. He is stuck living beside his own myth, and myths do not make good roommates. So, when we ask who was happier, we should include not only internal mood, but external embedding. The Ice King is embedded in a warped way. Simon is unembedded in a painfully clear way. It is possible to be cared for and still feel like you have no place. It is possible to be rejected and still feel like you belong to the world that rejects you, because at least the rejection is a form of participation. The tragedy is that we assumed Simon's return would restore belonging, but belonging is not something that can be restored by unlocking memory. Belonging is a relationship between a self and a world, and the world Simon belonged to is gone. The Ice King belonged to the new world because the new world grew around him. Simon returns like an artifact, precious, tragic, historically important, and still profoundly out of place. The first apocalypse in Simon's story is the Mushroom War, the collapse of his world into ruins and monsters. It is the obvious catastrophe, the one that turns his life into survival. But Simon experiences a second apocalypse that is quieter and, in some ways, crueler. restoration. Getting his mind back does not return him to stability. It forces him to comprehend the scale of what has happened to him, and comprehension is its own kind of destruction. The Ice King lives in a compressed time experience. He has memories, but they are not organized like a historian's mind. They do not line up into a coherent timeline that accumulates weight. The past does not stack behind him as a burden. In many ways, he experiences an eternal present. Whatever he is doing now becomes the whole world. His schemes feel urgent because his mind is built for immediate desire, immediate frustration, immediate fantasy. Centuries can pass, but they do not necessarily register as centuries in the way they would for a fully intact human consciousness. This is protective. It is also one of the hidden mechanisms by which his life remains bearable. A normal mind cannot emotionally metabolize hundreds of years of repeated rejection, humiliation, and failure. A normal mind cannot sustain grief across centuries without collapsing. The Ice King does not metabolize in that way. The failures do not accumulate into permanent identity in the same manner. He can be humiliated one day and still be excited the next day, because the humiliation does not fossilize into a narrative of his entire existence. He is not building a coherent autobiography. He is cycling through episodes. Restoration shatters this compression. Simon's mind returns, and with it returns the human capacity to understand time as narrative. Suddenly, the past is not just stuff that happened. It is my life. Suddenly, centuries become something he has to hold as belonging to him, even if he was not truly himself during them. This is a nightmare, because it is not merely remembering, it is being forced to accept ownership of a timeline that is too large to fit inside a person. The most brutal part is that this timeline is not grand, it is not heroic. It is not a mythic saga where centuries of life turn you into a wise immortal. It is, in many segments, ridiculous. It is a record of being a laughingstock. It is a record of acting out pathetic fantasies. It is a record of harming others and being rejected and returning again and again to the same humiliations. When Simon looks back, he does not see a dignified epic. He sees a sprawling archive of shame. That shame is intensified by the way the show trained us to laugh. Many viewers grew up laughing at the Ice King. The world of Ooh laughed too. Now Simon inherits the memory of being the target of that laughter. Restoration does not just give him trauma, it gives him meta-trauma, the awareness that his suffering was entertainment, to the characters, to the audience, to the structure of the show itself. This is why restoration feels like a second apocalypse. The first apocalypse destroyed his external world. The second apocalypse destroys the internal illusion that kept him functional. The Ice King's mind was a shelter built out of delusion, obsession, and present tense urgency. When the shelter collapses, Simon is exposed to the full weather of history. Scale changes everything about grief. Grief is difficult even when the world around you still resembles the life you lost. You can visit places, talk to people, engage in rituals that help the mind process absence. Simon cannot do that. His era is gone. The entire cultural environment that made his memories feel like home is absent. His grief is not only for Betty, it is for a world that no longer exists. And grief for a world is harder than grief for a person because it removes all stable reference points. The Ice King never had to stand inside this disorientation. He belonged to Oo's present. His identity and his routines were built inside the post-war world. He did not carry the constant contrast between then and now, because then was not available to him as a coherent lived reality. Simon carries that contrast every moment. Even a simple object can become evidence of historical wrongness, reminding him that everything he knew is myth, everything he loved is distant, and his own life has become a legend he did not consent to be. Timescale also intensifies responsibility. A decade of mistakes can be apologized for. A lifetime of mistakes can be integrated. But centuries of being someone harmful creates an impossible moral accounting. How do you make amends for what your body did across generations? How do you apologize to a world that has normalized your worst self as part of its folklore? How do you even measure harm when you cannot remember everything clearly enough to list it? The Ice King did not face that accounting. He harmed people, yes, but he did not process harm as an accumulating moral ledger. Simon does. Restoration gives him a ledger and then hands him the bill for centuries he never asked to spend. And this, again, connects to happiness. The Ice King's emotional life is shallow in some respects, but shallowness can be merciful when the alternative is drowning. Simon's emotional life is deep and accurate, but accuracy at this scale is crushing. It is one thing to know you lost your partner. It is another thing to know you lost your partner, your time, your dignity, your place, your world, and you did it in public. The show's decision to portray Simon's restoration as collapse rather than triumph is therefore not subversion for its own sake. It is recognition of what time does to a mind. Restoration is not simply the return of sanity, it is the return of a human brain's capacity to understand duration, and that capacity is not a blessing when the duration in question is monstrous. The crown is easy to label as pure evil. It is cursed, parasitic, and it destroys Simon. That label is true, but incomplete, because it implies the crown only subtracts. In practice, the crown also constructs. It builds a functioning psyche out of ruins. It is not healing, it is engineering, and the engineering is cruel. But the result is a mind that can survive in conditions the original Simon could not withstand for long. This matters because it reframes the Ice King not only as a corrupted Simon, but as an adaptation, a survival mechanism forced into being. The problem Simon faced in the early apocalypse was impossible. Protect Marceline, survive the aftermath, endure the ongoing loss of the world you knew, while staying psychologically intact. Simon chose the crown as a tool of protection. The crown chose Simon as a host. What happened next is not merely madness, it is an artificial solution to unbearable circumstance. Look at what the Ice King's mind provides. First, it provides narrowed memory. Memory is what creates narrative. Narrative is what creates grief that lasts. By suppressing memory, the crown suppresses the long arc of sorrow. It prevents the mind from constantly comparing what is to what was. Second, it provides repetitive goal generation. The Ice King always has something to do, some scheme, some plan, some princess fantasy. A mind that is always pursuing something has less space to collapse into existential paralysis. Third, it provides a fantasy identity. I am the Ice King is a coherent self-concept. It is false, but it organizes behavior, and organization is a form of stability. In other words, the crown does something like an emergency psychological architecture. Not the kind a therapist would build, not humane, not consent-based, but functional. It creates structure where Simon would have faced structural emptiness. It creates motivation where Simon might have been crushed by grief. It creates a social microcosm where Simon might have been destroyed by isolation. Even the penguins are part of the adaptation. They provide constant interaction. A kingdom provides constant role reinforcement, a setting in which the Ice King is always someone. This is why the crown can be compared, in a twisted mirror, to therapy. Therapy tries to make life livable by helping the mind develop tools, frameworks, coping strategies, and narratives that integrate pain. The crown makes life livable by deleting the parts of the self that can integrate pain at all. Therapy aims for agency. The crown replaces agency with compulsion. Therapy aims for connection. The crown creates distorted connection that repeats longing without resolution. Therapy aims for authenticity. The crown produces a stable lie. And yet, the unsettling truth is that stable lies can keep a person moving. They can keep the body alive. They can keep tomorrow reachable. Simon, restored, has authenticity and agency in principle, but he does not have the psychological scaffolding that made day-to-day existence simple. The Ice King did. The crown provided scaffolding through delusion. That is why Simon's restoration resembles withdrawal, not in the literal pharmacological sense, but in the structural sense. Imagine living for centuries with an artificial support system that generates purpose automatically. Then imagine that system vanishing overnight, leaving you with raw reality and the demand that you build purpose from scratch while carrying grief large enough to fill an era. Of course, collapse follows. Not because the authentic self is weak, but because the support was doing work the authentic self cannot instantly replace. This also complicates the morality of cure. In medicine, removing a harmful dependency is good, but the removal often requires replacement supports, otherwise the patient crashes. The show implies that Simon's world does not offer adequate replacements. He gets his mind back, but he does not get a life back. He gets clarity, but he does not get meaning. He gets truth, but he does not get scaffolding. The Ice King's happiness, such as it was, is therefore not random. It is part of the crown's architecture. A host that is constantly miserable might try to remove the crown, might self-destruct, might refuse the role. A host that is distractible, obsessed, and intermittently pleased is easier to maintain. The crown's design incentives align with the creation of a mind that can tolerate its condition. Even if the crown is not consciously benevolent, the effect is similar to an engineered coping system. This leads to an ethically uncomfortable idea. Sometimes what looks like pathology is also a survival adaptation, and sometimes removing pathology without building replacement meaning is not salvation, it is exposure. That does not mean we should prefer delusion. It means we should respect the function delusion served before we celebrate its removal. The show's maturity is that it allows this discomfort to remain. It does not claim the Ice King was better. It does not romanticize madness. It does not tell us to choose illusion over truth. Instead, it shows us the cost of truth when truth arrives without a world that can hold it. It shows us that authenticity is not a guarantee of well-being, because well-being is not only about being oneself, it is also about having a structure in which the self can live. Simon's tragedy is that restoration returns him to himself, but does not return him to a livable architecture. The Ice King's tragedy is that his livable architecture was built out of erasure. The question of who was happier is not a joke question. It is a question about what happiness actually requires, and what a mind will do when the only available happiness is the kind that comes from not knowing what you have lost. When people say that Simon should get better, they almost never mean a single thing. The phrase sounds compassionate, but it hides a cluster of assumptions that only line up in easy cases. In difficult cases, those assumptions tear away from one another, and Simon is the proof that they were never the same goal to begin with. His restoration exposes how imprecise our language around healing really is, and how often that imprecision serves the comfort of observers rather than the reality of the person being healed. Usually, when we say someone should get better, we mean that their suffering should decrease. We mean that daily life should become easier to navigate. We mean that they should regain agency, clarity, and coherence. We also mean, often without admitting it, that they should become legible again, recognizable as a person who fits into our moral and social expectations. These meanings blur together so often that we mistake them for a single outcome. Simon demonstrates that they are not. Simon restored is more himself than he has been for centuries. His memories are intact, his values are coherent, his emotional depth has returned. He understands who he is, what he has lost, and what matters to him. By any framework that prioritizes authenticity, restoration is a success. And yet, his suffering increases. His capacity to function decreases. His days become heavier, not lighter. Awareness does not free him. It immobilizes him. The Ice King, by contrast, violates nearly every criterion we associate with recovery. He is delusional, obsessive, socially destructive, incapable of insight, and often harmful. But he possesses something Simon lacks after restoration: psychological momentum. He wakes up wanting things. He acts on those wants. He is disappointed, rejected, mocked, and then he moves on. His pain exists in bursts, not as an ever-expanding totality. He does not wake up already exhausted by the meaning of his own existence. This creates an uncomfortable inversion. The person who is worse by every clinical and moral metric is more capable of enduring daily life than the person who has been fixed. That inversion forces us to confront the possibility that our idea of getting better prioritizes correctness over survivability. We want the person to be right about reality, even if being right makes reality unbearable. There is also a moral pressure embedded in recovery narratives that Simon cannot satisfy. Survival is often treated as a debt. If someone lives through something catastrophic, they are expected to justify that survival by becoming whole again, by transforming suffering into wisdom, by proving that the cost was worth paying. Simon cannot do this. Betty's sacrifice restored his mind, but it did not restore the world that made his life meaningful. He is alive, but the conditions that once justified being alive are gone. The expectation that he should now be grateful, productive, or resolved adds another layer of weight to an already crushing situation. The Ice King never carried this expectation. No one demanded that he make sense of his pain. No one asked him to integrate his trauma or honor sacrifices with a meaningful life. He was allowed to exist badly, chaotically, absurdly, without being held up as proof that recovery works. That allowance matters more than it seems. It creates room for survival without performance. This is why Simon's restoration feels less like healing and more like exposure. The Ice King's delusions acted as insulation. They narrowed the scope of awareness so that pain could not metastasize into despair. Simon's restored consciousness removes that insulation all at once. He gains truth and loses protection. He gains clarity and loses the ability to lie to himself in ways that make the day manageable. None of this means the Ice King's state was good. It means it was functional. Functionality is not the same as flourishing, but it is not nothing either. A life that can continue, even in a diminished form, is different from a life that collapses under its own accuracy. Simon's story forces us to acknowledge that healing is not a simple upward trajectory. It is a trade, and not every trade favours endurance. Adventure Time refuses to pretend otherwise. It does not frame Simon's suffering as temporary or necessary for eventual enlightenment. It allows restoration to be painful in a way that does not redeem itself. In doing so, it challenges the assumption that truth is always therapeutic and that authenticity is always merciful. Sometimes, the thing that makes a person more real also makes their existence harder to bear. When we say we want someone to get better, Simon asks us to be precise. Do we want them to suffer less, or do we want them to be right about their suffering? Do we want them to function, or do we want them to make sense? Do we want their pain to end, or do we want it to become morally acceptable to us? These questions are usually invisible. Simon makes them unavoidable. His restoration succeeds by our values and fails by his nervous system. The Ice King fails by our values and succeeds at continuing. That tension is not something the story resolves, because resolving it would require lying about what recovery costs. Instead, the story leaves us with the recognition that getting better is not a single outcome, and that sometimes the version of a person we most want to see is not the version most capable of living. By the time Simon is restored, the question is no longer whether he is better than the Ice King in any moral sense. That question has an obvious answer. Simon is ethically intact in ways the Ice King never was. He understands consent, he recognizes harm, he feels responsibility, guilt, and remorse. He is capable of moral reflection and restraint. The Ice King is not. If the comparison ended there, the discussion would be trivial. But Adventure Time does not allow the comparison to end there, because moral superiority turns out to be an unstable foundation for a livable life. Simon's restored ethics do not stabilize him. They destabilize him. They force him to confront the full scope of what his body did while his mind was absent, and they give him no way to undo it. Moral clarity becomes another weight he has to carry, not a source of strength. The Ice King does not carry this weight. He causes harm, but he does not integrate that harm into a narrative of self-condemnation. He does not replay his actions through an ethical lens. He does not experience guilt as a persistent state. This does not make him innocent, but it does make his existence lighter. He moves forward without dragging centuries of moral accounting behind him. Our instinctive preference for Simon is often rooted less in concern for Simon's lived experience, and more in our need for moral order. We want the story to affirm that awareness, responsibility, and ethical integrity are rewarded, even if the reward is delayed. We want to believe that doing the right thing, or being the right kind of person, eventually leads to a better life. Simon threatens that belief by doing everything right and still being miserable. Fionna and Cake sharpens this threat by refusing to provide a redemptive arc that would justify Simon's suffering after the fact. He does not turn his pain into wisdom that benefits others. He does not become a moral guide. He does not find peace through acceptance. He remains trapped in a state where he understands everything and can fix almost nothing. His correctness does not console him. The Ice King never had to ask whether life was worth continuing. That question requires reflective distance, narrative self-awareness, and the ability to imagine alternatives. The Ice King lacked all three. His desires were immediate. His disappointments were short-lived. He did not evaluate his life as a whole, and that absence of evaluation protected him from despair. Simon's restored consciousness gives him the tools to evaluate his life, and no satisfying conclusion to reach. This reveals a limit to moral preference. We can say Simon's life is better in principle, and still acknowledge that it is harder to live. We can say the Ice King's life was wrong, and still admit that it was easier. Adventure Time refuses to collapse these truths into a single verdict, because doing so would require pretending that ethics and well-being always align. The show also refuses to let us treat the Ice King as merely a mistake that needed correcting. If the Ice King were nothing but damage, Simon's suffering would feel like a necessary cost. But the Ice King functioned. He occupied a place in the world. He experienced motivation, connection, and continuity. His moral failures were real, but they did not prevent him from enduring his own existence. Simon's moral success does not grant him that same endurance. There is something deeply unsettling about this, because it undermines the idea that being right is enough. Simon is right about the past, right about Betty, right about the harm done, right about the meaning of his losses. None of this helps him live. The Ice King was wrong about almost everything, and that wrongness acted as a buffer between him and unbearable reality. The discomfort we feel when considering this is not accidental. It exposes how much we rely on moral narratives to reassure ourselves that suffering has a purpose. Simon's story offers no such reassurance. His pain does not purify him. It does not resolve into clarity. It simply exists, stubbornly, after the moment that was supposed to fix everything. The Ice King represents a life that fails ethically but succeeds at continuing. Simon represents a life that succeeds ethically but struggles to continue. The show does not ask us to admire the Ice King or reject Simon. It asks us to recognize that our instinctive hierarchy, where moral correctness automatically outranks lived bearability, is not as stable as we would like. By refusing to reward Simon for being right, Adventure Time forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Sometimes ethical awareness increases suffering without offering compensation. Sometimes the examined life is not better, only more accurate, and accuracy, when it reveals irreparable loss, can be a burden heavier than ignorance ever was. That does not mean ignorance is preferable. It means that the cost of awareness is real, and that cost is paid by the person who becomes aware, not by the values that demanded awareness in the first place. Simon pays that cost every day. The Ice King never had to. This is the price of being right. Adventure Time ends Simon's story without the thing most stories promise: resolution. There is no final integration, no moment where loss is balanced by meaning, no scene that reframes suffering as secretly worthwhile. Simon survives. He remains conscious. He remains grieving. The Ice King is gone. That is all. And that restraint, that refusal to turn restoration into triumph, is the most honest thing the story could have done. The Ice King does not die heroically. He does not transform into something better. He simply ceases. A consciousness that existed for centuries ends quietly, replaced by another that inherits the body, the world, and the consequences. The show does not frame this as murder or mercy. It does not frame it as justice. It simply presents it as what restoration costs. Something had to end for Simon to return, and the story refuses to sentimentalize that ending. Simon's restored life is not framed as a gift so much as a condition. He is alive, which is meaningful, but meaning does not automatically follow. He is himself again, but himself no longer fits the world he inhabits. He has truth, but truth does not shelter him. He has memory, but memory weighs more than it gives. He has agency, but agency does not provide direction when everything that once directed him is gone. The Ice King, by contrast, had direction without agency, momentum without truth, survival without understanding. That is not a better life in any aspirational sense, but it is a life that could continue without constantly interrogating its own legitimacy. The Ice King did not need answers. Simon does, and none exist that can satisfy the scale of his loss. This is where the story's argument ultimately settles. It is not arguing for madness over sanity. It is not romanticizing delusion. It is not suggesting that forgetting is a solution we should seek. What it is doing is stripping away a comforting lie. That awareness is always healing, that authenticity always liberates, that restoring the real person automatically improves their lived experience. Simon's suffering after restoration is not a failure of character or resilience. It is the predictable outcome of giving a human mind access to losses that cannot be repaired. His grief is not something he is doing wrong. It is something that makes sense. The show treats this not as a problem to be solved, but as a reality to be respected. The Ice King's happiness, such as it was, existed precisely because he was spared this reality. He did not know what he had lost, so he did not carry it. He did not evaluate his life as a whole, so it did not collapse under evaluation. He did not remember Betty, so he did not live with her absence. This was not noble, it was not chosen. But it was effective in a way Simon's restored clarity is not. Adventure Time leaves us with an uncomfortable ethical residue. If the Ice King was more bearable to be, and Simon is more correct to be, which state should we value more? The show refuses to answer because the answer depends on what we think a life is for. If a life is for truth, then Simon's state is superior, even if it hurts. If a life is for endurance, then the Ice King's state has an advantage we are trained not to acknowledge. What makes this especially painful is that Simon never asked to make this choice. The crown made it for him. Betty made it for him, out of love. The universe made it for him, out of indifference. Simon wakes up, restored not as someone who chose awareness over comfort, but as someone who must now live with the cost of a choice he did not get to make. The show's refusal to reward him for that cost is not cruelty, it is realism. Some sacrifices do not produce satisfying outcomes. Some restorations reveal damage rather than erase it. Some endings are survivals, not victories. And yet, the story does not end in nihilism. Simon continues. He searches. He asks questions. He engages with the world, however painfully. This continuation matters, not because it promises happiness, but because it acknowledges that existence does not require justification to persist. Simon does not need to turn his suffering into meaning to deserve to go on. He is allowed to live without resolution. The Ice King never needed permission to continue. Simon does not receive it either, and that is the point. Life goes on, unevenly, unfairly, without aligning itself to our values. Adventure Time honours that by refusing to clean up the mess it creates. So was the Ice King happier than Simon? In the narrow experiential sense, often yes. He had insulation, momentum, and a world that made sense to him. Simon has truth, memory, and grief without shelter. In the broader sense of dignity, agency, and moral life, Simon's state matters more, even if it hurts more. The tragedy is that these goods do not coincide. What the story leaves us with is not an answer, but a warning. Do not assume that getting what you want will save you. Do not assume that truth will heal you. Do not assume that restoration is the same thing as mercy. Sometimes the thing that kept you alive was also the thing you needed to lose, and losing it does not mean you are better off. Simon survives. That is the ending. Not happiness, not peace, survival. And in a story this honest about loss, survival without illusion may be the hardest ending of all.